Welcome to APG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss the module, the Communitarian Critique of Western Liberalism, with special reference to Sandel and Walzer. This lesson is written by Ritu Jaiswal of University of Delhi. I am Raghu Ramaraju from University of Hyderabad. One way to discuss the communitarian critique of liberalism is to frame it along the lines of radicalism and realism. Is it possible to be realistic if you are radical is one of the major concerns along which most of the discussions in Western political theory go around. So let us look at the first standpoint, which is political radicalism. Political radicalism gets epitomized in liberals. Liberals, who are the product of modernity, have accepted the primacy of an individual who is independent of society. This individual stands for individualism, liberty, freedom, autonomy, equality, rationality. Now, this individual is not contaminated by society. And the radical project of modernity or liberalism is possible because individual is thus situated in a isolated manner, independent of society. So this is a core of the radicalism of liberalism. Now, a counter to this comes in the form of communitarians, and they argue that what is the purpose of politics? The purpose of politics is to make people who are already in a society become a better human beings. Tell them how to organize their political activities. So politics or norms or rights are useful not in abstraction, not in isolation. They have to be imbricated within society. They are part of society. So no purpose will be served if you take individuals outside society, abstract them, and present radical but unrealistic proposals. So that is of no use to them. So this is the crux of the problem. So you have radicals, liberals, who insist on the primacy of rights which are not related to the society, and you have communitarians who argue that the good in community is the primary aspect for political discussion. This is the two kinds of extremities that you have. The first one, the radicalism in liberalism, gets epitomized in liberals like Immanuel Kant, contract philosophers in some respects, and in modern times it gets culminated in John Rawls. The communitarians are Alistair MacIntyre, Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor, Walzer. So what we are going to discuss today is the critique of liberalism by communitarians. Framing of the topic, let me now discuss three important thinkers. One, John Rawls, who is a 20th century liberal philosopher, and the second one is Sandel, the third one is Walzer. John Rawls, in his book The Theory of Justice, comes up with a radical presentation of a liberal view. He says that there is a theory of just and he also talks about how individuals are in a original position. Now, for instance, the man in the state of nature of contract philosophers, it becomes a bit problematic because people ask the question, was there a man in the state of nature ever? And the answer is not very clear. So he comes up with a methodological device where he proposes an idea of a original state. And in the original state, everybody is governed by a wheel of ignorance. They don't know what the other person is or has. So there is this, and there is an equal ignorance about other people. So this provides them an equality, an equal status where they are not attached to their culture, society, family, or any of those things. So it is a state from where you make rational choice. Now this idea of a original position, the idea of wheel of ignorance, play very important fundamental role in the philosophy of John Rawls. And Rawls says that the most important thing is to come up with the rational choice people make, and those choices get expressed in articulating the theory of justice. The core point of Rawls is the primacy of justice, the primacy of individual, and this is presented by Rawls in an ideal condition, and that provides a normative package of Rawls. So the radical project of Rawlsian liberalism lies in working out a moral theory or a political package, not within the matrix of society, but in a very hypothetical situation. Now, he requires this hypothetical situation in order to furnish the radical political aspects that are very important, namely equality, rationality, and equal opportunity, and the primacy of the individualism. All these things can be possible, can be properly articulated only in an ideal condition, however unrealistic that may be. It is unrealistic, Rawls is aware of it, but he says that the moment you become realistic and get into the descriptions of society, you have to compromise on your radical project. And he is not ready to compromise on his radical project, at least not in the beginning, though he does modify it in his later books like Political Liberalism and things like that. So that is an important point that comes out very clearly. So there is individual, and the individual is prior, and individual is autonomous, and individual is embellished with concepts like justice, equality, rationality. These are the very important aspects associated with this primacy of the individual in Rawls. And this is that stands in the liberal doctrine of 20th century in the writings of John Rawls. Now, let us look into Michael Sandel's critique of liberalism from a communitarian point of view. Michael Sandel is a communitarian. He, in his celebrated work, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, provides a critique of deontological liberalism of Immanuel Kant and John Rawls. The main claim of deontological liberalism is that this form of liberalism gives priority to right over good. That they already decide that something is right and then want everybody to come around that notion of right. So the moment you give importance or priority to right, everything else becomes secondary. Not only other things become secondary to right, right also is postulated as prior to other things. So it is prior to other things, and it is better, it is more primary in relation to other things. So these are the two important aspects that Sandel finds in liberalism in general and John Rawls' liberalism in particular. Sandel tries to show the limits of this liberal package. He finds that there is something that is problematic about this liberal package, where rights are privileged over any other thing, particularly goods. Now, he finds two major limitations surrounding liberalism. The first one is that if liberalism is wedded to objectivism, then liberalism should not canvass for one norm over other norms. Like this, in saying that right is primary, they have already declared their bias towards one norm over other norms. Now this is almost, tantamounts to taking sides. Now, and that defeats the purpose of their objectivism or their claims of rationality. If you are rational, the way of dealing with it or the modus operandi would be that you keep everything on the table and then adjudicate what is good and what is bad. Now that discrimination, that judgmental process is not followed by liberalism. They did not consider several virtues and then they did not decide that this virtue is better than that virtue. They have already decided right to be a desirable virtue. And this, he says, that it can be slightly dogmatic. It can be, said to be something like, self-evidently true. So he's saying that instead of postulating something, whether it could be right or something else, as desirable at the outset, he asks for neutrality. He's saying that liberals, if they are wedded to objectivism, has to show neutrality with respect to every moral idea or religious conception, and then decide which is good or which is bad, and after, as I pointed out, after adjudication. And that is not done by liberalism. So he seems to be showing that there is some kind of a dogmatic assertion of right over others lurking in the core of liberalism. This is one of the major criticisms Sandel wages on John Rawls in particular and liberalism in general. The other important point that he finds is their notion of self. That what is the notion of self that liberals had? The liberal notion of self is not a self that is rooted in society. The concept of self is outside society. As I pointed out in the introduction, this location of self outside the society makes the self or their politics very, very abstract and unrealistic. So there are two important limitations that Sandel finds in liberalism. One, liberals, instead of revealing their neutrality, displaying their neutrality towards all virtues and choosing one over the other after deliberation, they at the outset privilege and accept right over others, which he finds is objectionable. The second one is they postulate a concept of self which is not located, which does not perform, which does not reveal the moral or political nature of society, and this is a major problem that Sandel finds in liberalism. So, having pointed out these limitations in liberalism, Sandel goes on to show that there is a need to locate the self within society. And this is what he calls as you have to encumber the self. Self is all the time embedded in society. And one of the important aspects of this encumbering society is to reject Rawls' original position. Okay, because that original position is too abstract and it is unencumbered state. So Sandel finds, for instance, rights are not abstract, not ideal. Rights are dependent on empirical preconditions. Rights have to be imbricated within society. Justice in original position of Rawls then can be true only in societies that are already just. So if societies are already just, there is nothing for us to do. And more importantly, just societies are not just. Since societies are not just, and you postulate a package where you presume the justice, then bringing justice in an unjust society becomes very, very problematic. Bridging that gap, calibrating the normative package with the empirical reality becomes a serious problem. So he says that there is a need to emphasize the good and community, because self is always surrounded in by society and social institutions, and the morality, culture, they all play very important role. So he talks about how there is a need to imbricate self, encumber self in the society, so that we will have a realistic picture of society. The other important difference that we can see between Rawls and Sandel is Rawlsian self in the original condition with a veil of ignorance can be very fixed, since it is very abstract, and can be seen as unalterable. In contrast, the located self, encumbered self of Sandel is very dynamic and can keep on changing, because it is already imbricated within the dynamics of society. So it will not be static, it keeps on changing, it gets modified, it can get transformed, it can grow into a different, it can take a different nature. Given this position for Sandel, while Sandel's critique of Rawls is tenable, what is important to ask in this context is, it is true that Sandel is making a case for a self that is imbricated within society, and community is important, good should prevail over right, all these things are acceptable. But what is important to ask Sandel is, what is the community that he is talking about? Is the community of the communitarians community that is given from the pre-modern, in which case it comes up with certain kinds of problems? Or is it a community that contract philosopher talks about in the form of general will and things like that? I know there is a need to ask this question and look at the answers in Sandel's writings. The other important point is that while the idea of community or encumberedness of self gives politics realism, which is not a contested thing, it becomes very realistic. It gives us a realistic description about how society functions. But the problem is that there are several injustices in this real society that can become very problematic. So one might ask the question, is not describing tantamount to endorsing? Is it possible to describe something and not endorse it? Suppose if you describe and try to overcome those problems, don't they gear towards the radicalism postulated by liberals? So it is in this sense the descriptions that communitarians talk about is only a passing phase. The ideal condition, nevertheless, is a radicalism that is postulated by liberalism. So that is a point that can be splashed on to Sandel. Another important point that many feminists have pointed out against communitarians is that it is true that community is important. It is also true that community consists of family, but family is gendered. And the gender discrimination is based on injustice. So what is the point of describing something that performs injustice? Is the job of morality to describe the injustices, or is it the job of the morality to tell us what is justice and stick to it? So that is another important criticism one can level against Sandel. The other criticism on Sandel is pointed out by Will Kimlicka. Kimlicka points out that Sandel did not read Rawls' primacy of the self properly. Sandel's criticism on Rawls is based on taking self as temporally prior to the good. Okay, so there is self that is prior, and then something else happens. Now, Kimlicka points out that in fact this has to be looked not through the category of temporality, but should be looked at as conceptual category. Okay, the distinction is not that self is there prior in temporal order in history, but it is just a conceptual distinction that Rawls is making. And we do make conceptual distinctions every time. When I talk about a concept called table, that is distinguished from the object table. So why not make a distinction like this? I am not making any temporal kind of a point there. The other important point that one can make against Sandel is Sandel did not recognize the fact that Rawls did talk about different kinds of goods that are practiced in society. For instance, in his writings, he takes into consideration the values such as fraternity, benevolence, love, and things like that. So it is not correct to say that Rawls presents only an ideal and abstract moral package, and that does not have any significance or shades of community. There are important aspects of community that Rawls takes into consideration, but the fact remains that driven by the radicalism that is necessitated, Rawls sticks to the radical project and does not get into the kind of a descriptive details which communitarians insist on. Having discussed Sandel's communitarian critique of liberalism, let us briefly look at Walzer's. Walzer is also a communitarian, and he emphasized the importance of individuals' affiliation with communities, cultures, and a particular history, and also accepted that good of a community is embedded in the community rather than the rights of individuals. Walzer proposes a very important notion of what he calls as complex equality. Complex equality of Walzer, he recognizes both similarities and also respects differences. So it's not just simple equality, it's a very complex equality. One thing that is important about Walzer is he argues that no one good should be allowed to dominate over other goods. That there should be, you should see to it that there is no one virtue which is privileged over other virtues. I mean, he is now in fact is criticizing Rawls, who privileges rights over other things. So he is talking about how you must give importance to all goods. What makes that possible is there is a need to distribute different kinds of goods across the spectrum and encourage all of them. Instead of one norm as emphasized by Rawls, Walzer talks about plurality of goods. For instance, health, education, wealth, and various other things. And no value should be allowed to interfere or dominate the other value. So he is for a complex equality because he fears that simple equality can lead to domination. That if you prefer one virtue, that or you look for equality, that equality can lead to a domination, and which is what he rejects. So Walzer is of the view that a simple equality can lead to monopoly. Okay, and then he says in contrast that it is complex equality. In the course of time, give and take, crisscrossings, it will not allow the equality to be monopolized. So to summarize, we have seen that there are three important views. One is the liberal view as available in modern philosophers and in 20th century philosophy in the writings of John Rawls. And then you have a communitarian critic in Sandel and Walzer. And that on one spectrum, you have liberals emphasizing the primacy of right and radicalism, and you have communitarians pointing out the importance of being realistic, because morality is about society and we cannot have a very ideal conditions that are not useful. So Western political theory seems to be oscillating between these two extremities of liberalism on the one hand and communitarianism on the other hand. Thank you.